In 1998, Chavez runs for president basically on a no-party platform because he wasn't a politician. He came from the military. You know, he had never held an office, and he wasn't from the traditional political or economic elite. He came from a poor farmer family, and, you know, looks like this. I mean, mixed Indian, African hair, you know, darker skin, runs for office and wins. So he breaks this cycle of 40 years of two parties sharing power back and forth in this concentrated political and economic elite. Breaks the cycle, just like that. In a surprising result, actually, to a lot of people in the country, particularly that economic elite and political elite, but obviously many had voted for him. They wanted change in the country. So he runs on this platform that's based on two principal promises: anti-corruption, which corruption's a major and has been a major issue in Venezuela for decades, and constitutional reform. So up until this time, up until 1998, most of the governments before those two parties and that economic elite were very closely aligned and bonded with the United States, with U.S. economic interests and political interests, sharing one, obviously, the same similar ideology, neoliberal, capitalist, consumerist, you know, type of values and principles, and then, of course, economic interests, the U.S. being Venezuela's largest trading partner and allowing governments that basically were subservient to U.S. interests, allowing, you know, U.S. companies and multinationals, giving them priority to do as they please in the country. So in 1998, when Chavez wins, the first initiative, major project that begins to be implemented is the Constitution, but not constitutional reform, actually rewriting of the Constitution. So this is done, you know, it's a Constitution from 1961 after the fall of the last dictatorship. So what's done is a convention is convened, an assembly throughout the whole country. People are selected from their communities to represent them. They come together in this never-before-seen type of this level of inclusion and participation to draft their Constitution. This document of 350 articles, drafted, sent around in a draft form. People can comment on it, anyone. You don't have to be a lawyer, a scholar, or, you know, a politician. For everybody to participate in the creation of their Constitution, the backbone of a society. People create a document, 350 articles, it's put to national referendum, ratified by more than 70% of voters. So this Constitution changes everything, changes the structure of government, no longer 3 branches, now 5 branches, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive, but also the electoral and the people's power. People's power in Venezuela includes the Attorney General, the Public Defender, the Comptroller, and others that represent institutions directly dealing with the communities. Also, 2 terms are now allowed for the executive, because before only 1 term, but you could have non-consecutive terms as president. So 2 consecutive terms of 6 years are approved in the new Constitution, and the full spectrum of human rights. Civil rights and political rights, like are the most common, at least in the United States, known, what's left of them, the rights to vote and to freedom of expression and assembly, religion, those types of things, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. The right to a dignified life, the right to a decent wage, to a job, to a house, to food, to eat, you know, rights to medical attention, free, accessible education, free, accessible at all levels, not just basic, primary, but also up to postgraduate. So all these new rights in this new Constitution obviously mean nothing if they're just on paper. They're very pretty and nice to look at and say, look at all these rights we have. But if they're not implemented through legislation, then they're not manifested in reality. So this all starts to happen. In fact, Chavez has to run under the new Constitution for president again, because it's a new structure of government. He runs, he wins, this time with a more majority than he had won the year before. So this begins his first 6-year term in 2000. Then a package of laws under an enabling act is passed, and 49 laws that are going to, one, roll back the privatization that was in place when he wins office, but then also begin to implement these new rights, redistribute the wealth of the oil industry, the economic rights, things like that. This starts to happen. Around this time, other things are happening on the world scenario. One, there's a shift in the United States of governments from Clinton to Bush. And Venezuela takes over the leadership of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, of which it is a founding member, of one of 5 nations, the only Latin American nation. Takes over the leadership, and under Venezuela's leadership, the price of the barrel of oil goes from $7 to over $23. Great for oil-producing countries that are members of OPEC. I don't know if Canada's not a member. Right? Bad for countries like the United States that buy the oil. So this is happening. Chavez then also becomes, on the scene internationally, a public critic and opponent of U.S. foreign policy. He criticizes in a summit that's held here, actually, I think it was in Quebec, in Montreal, the expansion of NAFTA into the Americas, the Free Trade of the Americas Agreement. Comes out as a public opponent of that and critic. Now, this raises some eyebrows in the U.S. government, thinking, uh-oh, maybe we've got a problem. Venezuela, as much as you guys knew about Venezuela before Chavez, most of the United States is the same, or worse. You know, Venezuela was never an issue that people talked about because it was never a problem. Never any kind of thing going on there except steady supplier of oil. So this all starts to change. Then when September 11, 2001 happens in the United States, the bombing of the trade centers in the Pentagon, then the U.S. initiates the bombing campaign in Afghanistan, right? October 2001. Chavez, in a public speech, or I think he's on his program on television, declares and condemns this act as an act of fighting terror with terror, the bombing of Afghanistan. This provokes a severe reaction now from the U.S. government. They actually send their ambassador, Donna Hrinak, ambassador in Caracas at the time, to read a declaration to Chavez in the presidential palace demanding that he retract that statement publicly. And Chavez says, he actually interrupts her while she's reading the letter or the statement sent down from the State Department to read to the president in the palace, making this demand. And he stops. He's like, "Madam Ambassador, excuse me, you can't come into our country. This is our country. You're an ambassador. Come into our country and make demands that we retract a statement about criticizing a policy and action of another government. We're a sovereign nation. We have the right to say and do as we please, and to criticize and have our opinions on anyone's foreign policy." And they basically asks her to leave, but she literally begs him, "Can I just finish reading the rest of the letter and then I'll go?" She had to comply with her duties. So he lets her. He's a gentleman. He lets her read it, and then she leaves. And she actually leaves the country. A new ambassador is assigned to Venezuela, but who's actually much worse, Charles Shapiro. So all this stuff is happening, right? The new constitution, the new rights being implemented, rolling back privatization, the price of oil going up because, in large part, Venezuela's leadership, Chavez, public opponent of Venezuelan foreign policy, of U.S. foreign policy, privatization issues, free trade of the Americas, and, of course, the war, right? And he stands up to U.S. intimidation and threats when they make these demands on Venezuela. So showing that Venezuela is no longer subordinate to the United States. This is when things start to shift in terms of U.S. policy towards Venezuela. I am a U.S. citizen and a Venezuelan citizen. I have a Venezuelan family, and I live in Caracas. I've lived there now permanently over the past 2 years. I lived in Venezuela, Mérida, a city in the Andes Mountains, in the 1990s, as I said before. Went back to the U.S. actually in 1998 to finish my law degree in New York. I'm a lawyer from New York, and then got back involved in Venezuela, first because of all this stuff going on with the Constitution. I found it incredibly fascinating, the way that the Constitution was developed in Venezuela, and then, of course, the quantity and quality of rights in that Constitution are also extraordinary. The largest number of human rights, so detailed, 350 articles of any constitution in the world. But, of course, when the coup takes place against Chavez, I'd always been, interested and had studied and researched, investigated issues of U.S. intervention in Latin America. So when this happens in one of my countries, being caused, of course, by the other country, and as a lawyer, I felt the duty and obligation to find some kind of evidence to figure out what was going on, what role had the United States government had in the coup against Chavez that takes place in April 2002. After the coup in 2002, actually in 2003, started this investigation using the Freedom of Information Act in the United States to try to request documents from the U.S. government itself about their role in the coup. The idea initially was there, well, we all knew there was a U.S. government role in the coup, but what was that? And could we get that information now without waiting 20 years? There's actually no time for it. You don't have to wait 20 years to request documents. For the government themselves to declassify them, well, that could be anywhere from 20 years to eternity, never. So you can still request them at any time. So together with the help of a journalist in Washington, Jeremy Bigwood, who'd been doing these types of requests for many years, and also journalists, I don't know how the laws are here in Canada, your Freedom of Information law, but in the United States, journalists get privileges. They don't have to pay the photocopying expenses, and that can really add up when you have like 10,000 documents, 25 cents a page. And they get a priority in terms of the rapid response. So you can get a more rapid response because it's in the public interest, they assume. If it's a journalist, the information will be made public. I'm not a journalist, I'm a lawyer. So together we did more than 500 requests initially, since 2003, to about 15 different agencies. And the response was just extraordinary. I mean, completely unexpected also, very quickly. So the first documents that come in, January 2004, so it was literally 3-4 months after the requests had been submitted, 2,000 pages of documents from one entity. An entity that was referred to by Yolanda as the National Endowment for Democracy, right? So these documents refer to the time of that I was talking about just before, 2001. All this stuff is happening. You know, the U.S. is now starting to look a little bit at Venezuela, thinking, here, what's going on? Here's this president, he's not subordinate to our interests. There's all these changes happening in the country. They're rolling back privatization. He's a public opponent of our foreign policy, and making oil prices go up and all this kind of stuff. So this entity, the National Endowment for Democracy, begins to fund, in fact, quadruples funding to groups in Venezuela. So they quadruple, it's a congressionally funded entity, quadruples funding to groups in Venezuela in the 6 months before the coup. This one was published by Jose Marti from Cuba. Lots of solidarity from the Cubans. Anyway, so three fronts of attack. First one being the financial. This begins actually then in 2001. The National Endowment for Democracy really hadn't funded groups in Venezuela, some, but very minimal. Quadruples this funding. All of a sudden this opposition movement is built, right? 6 months before this coup takes place in April 2002. Then, a couple months later, December 2001, in fact, and for those of you who haven't read the Chavez Code, I recommend reading it. Also because it has in the back at least 100 pages or so of some of the documents, some of the most important documents. The others I have available on a website. But December 2001 in particular, so 5 months before the coup, State Department representative in Venezuela, the embassy, sends this cable up to Washington, to the State Department and others, talking about this individual, statesman's like, and all this stuff, and we want him to meet with the top levels of U.S. government. He's going to be on a trip up there. And they refer to him as the right man for the right time in Venezuela. His name is Pedro Carmona, and he was the president of Fede Cámaras, Venezuela's Chamber of Commerce, right? December 2001. So quadrupling of funding to groups, anti-Chavez groups from the National Endowment for Democracy, promoting the right man for the right time in Venezuela 5 months before. Another document under the Freedom of Information Act that we received March 2002, so a month before the coup. The embassy sends up a cable to Washington, to the CIA and to the National Security Council, the Defense Intelligence Agency. It's actually authored by the CIA's liaison or field officer in the embassy in Caracas at the time, Frederick Cook. Sends up this document where they're writing, something about something that had taken place that day. I'll read. With much fanfare, the Venezuelan great and good assembled on March 5th in Caracas, in the Caracas Esmeralda Auditorium, to hear representatives of the CTV, which is the Labor Federation, Fede Cámaras, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Catholic Church present their bases for a democratic accord, 10 principles on which to guide a transitional government. So the Venezuelan great and good, the opposition, that's how the U.S. government refers to them, the great and good, right? March 5th, present their transitional government, their guide to their transitional government. So a little bit more than a month before the coup. The document contains a statement that should have been censored. I'm glad it wasn't, right? But normally they would have. In fact, a lot of these documents you get come partially declassified, fully declassified. You never know. A lot of censorship could be like they come, especially the Pentagon, they use the old school method of big black marker. So some that you get, and let me see if I can find one. Well, maybe not. Anyway, sorry. Some of them just look like a big black blob, you know, just all kinds of black marker. Others have like whited out the areas. Anyway, this document in particular, talking about, you know, finally they've come together. They've got this plan for their transitional government. The comment, there's a comment, it says comment, semicolon. The comment included, that's comment of the author of the document, is another piece falls into place. So what are they talking about? They're talking about finally they've come to an agreement for their transitional government, and they've created, you know, the guide for the transitional government. A month later, April 6, 2002, so 5 days before the coup, this top secret CIA document, which could be considered, you know, of all the documents, because a lot of them are very sort of like that one. You have to read through over and over again, and then you find this comment, another piece falls into place. Now that's pretty that's pretty clear. But this one in particular, the CIA top secret Senior Executive Intelligence Brief, April 6, 2002, declassified in part, talks about conditions ripening for a coup attempt, so 5 days before the coup, and actually refers to the level of detail in the reported plans, which means they had the plans, right? Targeting Chavez for arrest, provoking violence in an opposition march, slated for soon, those first days of April, those first weeks, and then installing this now agreed upon transitional government. So here we've got the funding, the quadrupling, the promotion of the right man for the right time in Venezuela, another piece falling into place. They finally got their transitional government, and the detailed plans laid out. You all saw the film, so you know what happened. So on April 8th, 3 days before the coup, there's this chance meeting, accidental, a reception being held for a military attaché, Chinese, in Caracas, who's on his way out or something. All the other military representatives are there, the U.S. ones and the Venezuelan as well. And one of the United States military attachés goes up to one of the Venezuelan who's there. And of course, on military uniforms, only one of your last names fits. In Latin America, we use the paternal and the maternal names. So only one name fits. So the general who was there at this reception, his name is General González Cárdenas. And one of the generals involved heavily in the coup, his name was General González González. But of course, González Cárdenas doesn't fit, so it just says González. Both of them are bald. So the U.S. military attaché goes up thinking it's González González and says, hey, what are you guys waiting for? We've got the submarines off the coast and all this equipment is here. You know, why haven't you contacted us? And González Cárdenas, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So he just says, you know, oh, I'll talk to my superiors and get back in touch with you. So this military, he's a captain actually, from the United States, hands him his business card and he says, there's an operational cost to this. You know, you better get in touch with us soon, right? We've got the business cards. I've got them actually in my second book. And all this other information, those testimonies. So, you know, here, April 8th, 3 days before the coup, now we know there are U.S. submarines, helicopters, all kinds of equipment waiting. April 10th, 1 day before the coup, the General González González, the real one involved in the coup, goes on television declaring himself in military rebellion, right? That day, Chavez was scheduled to go to a summit in Costa Rica. So he cancels the trip, stays in the country. That's why thinking, well, now the generals are rebelling, you know, there's stuff going on, I'm not leaving. I mean, that was the purpose of calling for military rebellion on television. Stays in the country, and then the whole thing plays out.